Good morning, everyone. You're all sounding very awake for an early morning, so thank you so much for being here. I'm glad you were all busy talking. You didn't have to see my entrance up here. There were no steps, so it was a really interesting approach onto the stage. So welcome, everyone, to the 28th Annual American Express Restaurant Trade Program. I'm Danielle Wallace, Vice President of Merchant Services in the U.S. for American Express. Thank you. And for over 35 years, American Express has partnered with restaurants nationwide to help them grow their business and stay competitive. At Amex, we work hard every day to help build strong relationships with our merchants, help them seize new opportunities, and overcome challenges to ensure that they grow. Yesterday afternoon, I had the pleasure of meeting many of you at Ajax Tavern. Hopefully most of you were there. I think I met many of you. Did you guys have that hummus? Was it amazing? Right? So big thank you to Chef Alon Shaya. We had beautiful views of the mountain while we were there, and we're really looking forward to continuing the weekend with these amazing panels and a great happy hour, which hopefully you all will attend, which will feature Will Guidara as well as his team from the Nomad in 11 Madison Park. Now, before we start the panel, I just want to take a minute to thank a few people. So first, the panelists and all the attendees for giving their time and joining us today. I'd like to thank the Hotel Jerome staff, who year after year just do a tremendous job with this program. And then last, but by no means least, Baltz & Company. They've been amazing partners to American Express for over a decade. I actually think, yes, please. Phil and I were talking yesterday, and I think actually we're going on 19 years together, so they're great partners, so a big thank you to Baltz. Now, with that, I'd like to turn this over to a man who needs no introduction, although I'll give one anyway since it's written here. And I do it, and every year, whenever I introduce him, I always say this, but it always makes me feel very inadequate whenever I read this. But Andrew Zimmern is an amazing man. He's a chef, a writer, a teacher, a TV host, a producer. You can see him on several Travel Channel shows, including Bizarre Foods with Andrew Zimmern. He's a James Beard Award winner, a contributing editor at Food & Wine magazine, and the author of 3 books. He's also the board of director in his spare time for several charities. So please join me in welcoming Andrew. Thank you.
How's everybody doing this morning? This is just absolutely wonderful to be back and moderating panels here for this group. I find ideas to be the most stimulating ways that human beings can connect with each other. And the world is not made up of swanky parties and expensive bottles of wine and amazing food and all the other bright, shiny objects that this weekend distract me. Like, I mean, I'm a bright, shiny objects person, and don't get me wrong, it's too early to swear. It's too early to swear. But here's so much of that are the things that distract us from what's really important, which is people. The world is made up of people, right? And so I love the conversations that we have. I love the provoking ideas that come out of these things. And I think this year's panels, when I was looking at the list, I was super, super excited to do this. So thank you to Amex, thank you to Baltz, thank you to the Hotel Jerome for making all this happen. And thanks to all the moderators, panelists, but mostly thank you, because it's your energy and it's your questions and it's where the conversation goes that I think this thing gets the most interesting. Because certainly nobody came here to listen to me talk about that, but I thought I'd throw that idea out there. I love the titles of these panels. Meet the Masters, Cultivating Culture. And I was most obsessed with this idea of cultivation, right? For me, and I have spent, I don't know, the last 15, 18 years documenting culture all over the world, the last 12 on television, but I'm kind of obsessed with it. And I define culture as the manifestation of our humanity collectively regarded, right? So if we apply that to the restaurant or a group of restaurants or business, however you want to look at what you do, whether it's 1 unit, 100 units, 10 employees, 10,000 employees, What is the importance of that culture? How do we define it? Does the customer see it? Do we try to grow it and actively lean into it? Or is it something that just comes naturally from us, and is it better to let it evolve? And when do you put the foot on the gas pedal there? And today we're lucky to have, and I'm not sure I remember having sets of people, partners essentially, who work together and have created the cultures of their business together and work in the same space. So to my left, your right, is Bobby Stuckey and Lachlan Patterson from Frasca. Longer bios in your little manuals. Oh, by the way, I forgot. Business, come back at 1:15 for the next panel. Enjoy the cocktail hour later this afternoon that 11 Madison Park is hosting. Outside, there's lots of signs, and there's a wonderful little box with a green light, red light that says, liked it, hated it, which is really, really valuable so that every year we can make these bigger and better. So please avail yourselves of those and use the little Twitter and hashtaggy things on the backs of your, what do we call those?
Badges.
Flavor Flaves. On the backs of your Flavor Flaves
Your lantern.
are everyone's social handles. To my right, Sabado Sagaria from Union Square Hospitality Group and Danny Meyer from Union Square Hospitality Group. And only because it would be silly not to. I've had the pleasure of listening to Danny talk on this subject by himself for quite a long time. So I know he has something to say about this. So I thought it would be a good place to start. So I'm not trying to pick on you, because we're friends away from here. So he'll call me or pull me aside and say, you picked on me. But you know, the USHG is so well known for its culture, right? And you've written about it. You talk a lot about it. When you were opening the first restaurant, was it on your mind? Was it something that came out of your principles naturally and just got embedded into the DNA of the first restaurant, kind of as best practices, and then you grew it and tweaked it and got its horsepower revved up? Or did it evolve? I've been dying of curiosity. I've never asked you that question as many times as I could have.
No, that's a very easy question. So that's far from picking on me. Completely not intentional the first time around with Union Square Cafe. And Gramercy Tavern opened 10 years after Union Square Cafe. So I think that everything I did with Union Square Cafe with one restaurant for 10 years was intuitive, and it just felt like the right thing to do. And it wasn't until there were two restaurants where half the time I was at one and half the time I was at the other, and you couldn't expect people at the one you were not at to be mind readers in terms of how you do things. And so what had always been intuitive had to become intentional. And the way you make your culture intentional is to give language to it. There's no culture in the world that is not driven by language. Fraternities, the restaurant industry, religions, businesses, families. There's a common language that every culture has. And I just want to take a second. You gave kind of an elegant definition to culture. I think it's irresponsible to have this conversation without people on this panel saying what is culture to them. And for me, there's two ways that we think about it. The first is that, very simply, culture is the way we do things around here. And so when I hear people say we have to work to have a culture, no, you don't. There is a way you do things around here. What you have to work at is to have an intentional culture that is hopefully an uplifting culture that helps get your organization to a better place.
Well, now I'm going to angry text you because that was my second question.
All right, but the second way I look at it, and was thinking about this, especially in the context of food and wine, is that everyone in this room knows probably a lot about wine. And I think of culture as being the terroir of an organization. And no matter what grapes you plant in your terroir, they're going to taste the same. You try to go get the best grapes you can. We all try to get the best employees we can. But when you plant those grapes in your soil, in your microclimate, the way you cultivate it, the way you take care of it, they're going to taste different than if you plant them in someone else's soil. And so that's what's beautiful about it, is that if you can really care for that soil, it's a really, really distinctive way to make your restaurants taste a little different and feel a little different than anyone else's.
Is there advice that you have for, because you talked about doing the right thing, and that's a very difficult thing for some folks to define.
Is that a question?
Yes. How do you define, I mean, how do you know what the right thing, where did that come from for you?
Well, everyone who runs a business gets to decide what they think the right thing is. And what my right thing is not necessarily Bobby's right thing. Mm-hmm. But it is our responsibility to know what our true north is and convey it, because it becomes the reason someone would choose to either work for you or not work for you. And if you don't tell them what your true north is, what your culture is, what your values are, then it's kind of like going to the airport and saying, I'll just go to any gate and fly any airplane anywhere because I just want to take a trip. It's not fair. So we have to tell people what it is.
And at what point, or was there a point where you actually started documenting those principles and those ideas? Because you talked about the intentionality and you talked about the necessity of language.
All right, I'm starting to get a little bit self-conscious because we have a panel here.
No, I have questions. I have questions for everyone. We have a lot of time to talk about this, but you raised a good point, and I want to know how each person did it.
Well, for me, I can so clearly remember the moment, and I've maybe even shared this with you before, but it was in 1995, and Gramercy Tavern was a handful of months old, and the only economic efficiency I had been able to find between two restaurants was that our bookkeeper was responsible for both restaurants. And one day I saw him, and he had two sets of keys because he would come in early in the morning. And one set of keys had a keychain with that yellow smiley face that you saw in the 1980s. And one keychain had a frowning face. And I said, tell me about those. And he said, well, the frowning face is obviously Gramercy Tavern. And I went, what are you talking about? And he said, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like one of our restaurants. And he was telling the truth, and it didn't. And I didn't know why. And we didn't do things the same way. If culture is how we do things around here. And not a day or two after that, there was just this awful experience where there was a woman hosting a business lunch for 8 people. And she came up to me afterwards, and she was also a regular at Union Square Cafe. And she said, if you keep treating people the way you treat them here, you're never going to make it like you did at Union Square Cafe. And I said, what do you mean? And she told me the story about how she had finished only half of her salmon, at which point the server took away the salmon, gave her a coat check tag saying that your half of the salmon will be waiting for you at the coat check, left it on the bill. And I went to the general manager who was running the restaurant. I said, why in the world did you do that? Well, because she was trying to get a free salmon from us. And I'm getting sick just telling that story today, but I realized at that moment it was my fault for not saying, that's not how we do things around here. It's just not. And so I held an all-staff meeting that next Saturday at Gramercy Tavern. And for the first time in my entire career, which was now about 11 years old at that point, I named something which we called enlightened hospitality. And I was, for the first time, able to articulate how I expected people to make choices and prioritize things, which is way different than a service manual, how to set a table, or a recipe, how to cook a dish. It was, how do we do things around here? How do you make choices? How do you behave? And then it's been trying to refine that every single year and grow it from that point forward. But that was the moment when I just hit rock bottom in terms of saying, I can't have my name on a place that is behaving like that towards people.
Sabato, a lot of your job is operationalizing that. I'm being very general. So listening to Danny talk about that, and it's hard to harness moments and instincts and, you know, doing the right thing and actually harden some of them into actual practices that you can then put into place throughout the company and have people respond to. So how do you take all of that and actually, you know, put it into the DNA of people who you want to have work in your place, who are good at what they do, but need the polishing on the culture?
So I think a lot of times when there's teaching or training, it focuses on the how, not necessarily the why. And so one thing, as I was listening to Danny, how we can actually give every employee a lens with to view all interactions, whether that's with a guest or with their coworkers. And I think it was 3 years ago when we launched the family values, and we tried to distill it down to basically 4 family values: excellence, hospitality, integrity, and entrepreneurial spirit. And so that is the lens which we hold each other accountable, and also ask our teams, if they're in a situation and you look at how you're responding or engaging with any stakeholder, how can you check those boxes? And that becomes the roadmap for that, where they can improvise, but as long as doing it through the family values, it allows us to move forward in that. And for our teams and our leaders, we talk about walking the talk, and every action that you do, that's done through the lens of the family values, so your team actually sees you embodying that. And I think that's really started to resonate with all employees, front of house, back of house, in our home office.
Is it easier or harder to put that into play outward facing from your staff to guests, or is it or inward facing in how people relate to each other? Because you have a large restaurant group, you have a lot of people there, and when you mention those 4 values, you know, that's as much about how you treat the guest as to how you treat the person working next to you.
And everyone on our team is on that same playbook. But when we bring guests in the equation, they don't know our playbook. And what's the magic of it is when they can feel that come through. But it's up to us to really make sure that that is customized for every interaction with those guests.
So it sounds like it's not chicken or the egg. It starts internally.
It has to.
It's an internal thing that then shines outward and everyone can then see.
Correct.
How often are those values brought up to staff and people? Do they mention them? Are they printed on a something in the locker room? I mean, I'm just curious.
Yes, yes, and yes. One of the things that we've done is we created a CDR program, Caught Doing Right. And we have a little card, and every morning I wake up and in my inbox I read through every single TripAdvisor, Yelp, OpenTable, Facebook, Google comment that was posted in the last 24 hours. And talk about a cold shower in the morning. That's a great way to wake up. But
a couple laughs.
Yeah. What's really makes me get goosebumps is when I see an employee that has been recognized by one of our guests, and we don't walk up to the table and say, hello, my name is, or we're not wearing name tags. So to think that a guest spent an hour, 2 hours in one of our restaurants and had a interaction with an employee that left had such an emotional connection that they went home unsolicited, logged on, and then wanted to share with their followers and their peers in the world about how that made them feel. That's something that is so special. And so I handwrite a CDR for that, and on that there's 4 family values, and I check which one that one embodied, and do the old-fashioned thing, put it in an envelope, seal it up with a wax stamp, and then we mail it off to the restaurant. And so they're delivered that in front of their peers. I was at the Modern the other day as they were reading them out, the guest comment and then also the CDR. And so that's actually showing how not just the leaders are walking the talk, but how each of their peers are walking the talk. And so it's just constantly reinforcing that day in, day out, every opportunity that you have, whether that's a coaching opportunity or whether that's a celebrating an employee.
That's fantastic. We're starting. We're going to do that. I love it.
Can I just add a quick thing to that? Sabato does that as the leader of all the restaurant organization, but every employee also has these Post-it notes that are these CDRs, and down the left side, they're very small, are the 4 family values, and then there's like 4 lines, and every time you see someone else on the team doing something that went over and above in terms of excellence or hospitality or integrity or entrepreneurial spirit, it's part of your responsibility to catch someone else on your team. It could be a dishwasher catching a waiter doing something, or a waiter catching a dishwasher, and they circle that and it goes up on the bulletin board. And that kind of reinforcement takes us out of the business of talking about family values, which could get kind of icky after a while, but instead, no, you don't want culture to become a cult. That would be dangerous. But it does give people the opportunity to say, I actually feel good when I know what winning looks like.
The number one psychological reinforcer for good behavior is label praising. Which is, I mean, I've learned that in child psych stuff, so it's amazing how you've been able to implement that all the way down. That's fantastic, very inspiring. Bobby, when you left TFL and said, okay, I'm doing my own thing, what did you take from your experience there, and what did you choose to make your own, and how much of what happened in the first Red Frasca was intentional or just came through the sum total of your experience?
Well, a couple things. When Lachlan and I decided to leave the French Laundry, we weren't very well funded, and this is kind of a horror story. My wife is going to do some shopping therapy after I remind her of this. But we couldn't afford, Lachlan had to live with Danette and I. And when you leave TFL, no matter what era, there's a very certain feeling there of what you do. And when you really get to digest your experience once you leave. I think it's hard when you're in the format of Thomas's world to really understand what you're going through there. And Lachlan and I got to do that decompressing literally as he lived with Danette and I. And we were working on our business plan. It was that story in itself was a total casino, right? Like Lachlan's living with Danette and I, and it's nuts. And we are working at a restaurant together trying to build a space, and neither of us are handy. Right. I mean, the whole thing is a disaster. But every day we could we could digest what happened at TFL, and it let a lot of things come up and let us jointly talk about what we wanted in our culture. And we, in our little den where we live, there's a little computer room. Lachlan and I had a list of things that we loved from his experiences in France, my experiences actually at the Little Nell before the French Laundry that re-percolated up, and what we wanted as our vision. And that marker of notes is now, my wife found it and framed it, and a few years ago gave it to Lachlan and I as a gift, and it's in our office. And it's amazing, those ideas we had sitting in that den, writing it, we still use every day.
That's incredible. What were
But I think it was a combination of,
well, the dialogue, I mean, you know, I'm left to my own devices. I'm the most seriously an absolute boring toad. I need someone else. You know, I mean, that's where I think the people and conversation is, you know, you have to interact. I think that's what culture is. I mean, just sitting with your own ideas, oh, I'm great, oh, I'm correct. I mean, you just can't. I mean, it's the most boring conversation in the world in my own head. It's either fear-driven or it's fantasy. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But when you actually dialogue with another human being, amazing things happen. And, you know,
and mind you, he doesn't live with us anymore.
well, that's not what your wife told me. Yeah. But when I'm really fascinated by this because I've left businesses with someone else to start something else. Did the dialogue change? You know, pre-exit to post-exit. I mean, obviously the post-exit becomes much more intentional. Like, where are we going to put the stove, right? I mean, there's actual like nuts and bolts, chop wood, carry water stuff. But you know, when you're sitting there, you know, at work during those little moments, like, gosh, when we do this, I hope we. Did a lot of that wind up on the board, or was it new stuff that you dialogued in the den that wound up on the board?
I think it was I think it was like a combination of once we digested what we had just gotten to experience, and things that we had maybe had with ourselves that we wanted to do. I mean, one of the things was like, everyone talks about hospitality, but hospitality is not something that you like flip the switch on, walk onto the dining room and do it. You have to do it with your employees, with your person dropping off your groceries or whatever. And I think once we said, hey, let's make sure we're hospitable to everyone that's around us, coworkers, employees, delivery drivers, that helped the hospitality culture.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not trying to, well, I am trying to put you on the spot, but how did you guys decide? I want your story of how it sort of went down that said, we need to go out and do this thing on your own. And what was it that you thought you could add to the world? Because it wasn't just blind ambition, like we're going to make buckets of money. I mean, because I don't think anyone goes in the restaurant business, that's the first thing that they think of. I mean, quite the opposite. It's like, how are we going to afford to live from now on? You know, because things go from really good to like, oh my God, I own something, and you know, leaders eat last, right? And so,
great book, by the way.
Fantastic, my favorite, one of my all-time heroes.
Great.
What was the thinking as you were going into that about the partnership between you guys?
Sure.
Because either one of you, no, that's what I'm asking. What was the, you know, because either one of you could have done something on your own.
Yeah, I mean, I think just real quick to your last question, and then I'll answer that. I think what was really very fascinating. I was a very young guy when we moved to Boulder. I was 28 years old. It was 14 years ago. I didn't know the first thing about running a restaurant or running a business, even though I know I wanted to have one. But we felt like at that time, and our parents felt the same way, and I think maybe press may have felt the same way. They're like, you have the best jobs in the industry at that time. Why would you leave, right? Like, perhaps Bobby had the best wine job in America, right? Why would you leave? You know, San Pellegrino list came out. French Laundry's the #1 restaurant in the world. Why would the wine director depart who won the James Beard Award? So, I think my mic go out
for a second.
There he is. So I think there was a couple things about. There were two things for me that I take away from our time at the French Laundry that I really wanted to that we really wanted to duplicate, and I think the very first thing was we noticed like an extraordinary generosity to the guest when we were there, an unbelievable, almost unreasonable generosity, and I think we turned that generosity into generosity for our staff. Because we didn't know the first thing about necessarily creating a culture of values in a business, and we were scrambling just to get open. We opened with no light switch covers, for example. Ran out of money and just got going. So for us, the generosity became all about our employees. And I remember even before Bobby and I were even paying ourselves, we would walk down the street together once a week to deposit a check in what we called the Frosca vacation account. And it was a checking account that we hoped to build enough money by the end of the year to take the entire staff to Italy. And this is, I think, like for us was the foundation of building team unity, right? And the second thing that really sticks with me about the laundry that I knew we wanted to do, but it was the greatest thing I'd ever really felt when I was there, was this concept of treat it like your own, and someday it will be. I think it sounds really great, but it's very difficult to achieve, and it usually takes perhaps decades to get there. And I think that we're actually just starting to get into that moment now, 14 years later. But I think what built it for us was this extraordinary generosity with our teams.
And how did that translate then into the next place, the pizza? I mean, how do you then transfer all of that learning from Frosca into the next project?
Yeah, so 2010, we opened a full-service pizzeria next door. It shared a contiguous wall, and I think that was our first opportunity to really let someone run on their own who had given so much to the company. And again, our natural tendency was to reward them with some inspiration. And so we sent one of our long-term employees who had lived in Italy, went to culinary school there, spoke Italian, was young and single, could afford to get beaten up, and he went and lived in Naples for 6 or 7 months. And that was the foundation that restaurant was built on. In fact, I'll say I don't think if we hadn't approached it in that same way, where that particular individual had felt such the gift of generosity, we probably never would have started the express version of those locales, because that same individual no longer works for Frosca Food and Wine Inc., and now is an employee in this other channel business we have.
On that original list that was on that wall, was generosity on there?
Yeah.
Do you remember some of the other words or ideas?
Yeah, authenticity, hospitality, value, but generosity to the guests and to the employees.
Yeah. And that generosity, how do you do it internally?
Well, it was weird. I mean, I remember we opened and literally people thought we were certifiably insane. We left the French Laundry and someone was like, wait, we should do intervention because we really like Danette. This isn't nice. And we moved to Boulder. And mind you, when we moved to Boulder, the town did not take reservations. It was not set up for a restaurant that we were about to do. And we couldn't get staff. So we knew we had a staff member who had come from a hotel environment, and he was a young man who had a pre-existing condition. He's like, I can't work for you guys. I got to go back to the hotel environment. I need insurance. And that was like, okay. I said, okay, let's get an insurance plan. Like we had not paid ourselves. Like it was nuts. And we're like, okay, let's get an insurance plan for the staff. And 13, 14 people didn't think that way as a startup restaurant and starting in that
right.
That deal.
But looking back, Lachlan, that sounds counterintuitive, right? I want to go over here, so to do that, I'm going to go over there. I mean, you haven't paid yourselves, you haven't done, that there's limited reinvestment in the actual place itself, and your focus is on internally making everyone feel loved up.
Yeah, it was cuckoo, yeah. But it worked, and I think that, what's really interesting to me is that, our industry, I think one thing that really holds it back is that I think it's not academic enough. And I don't think there's enough reading going on, and I don't think there's enough pulling from other types of industries. Like, let's face it, the business fundamentals in a business are so often overlooked at the expense of how the chef wants to portray themselves, or what it is the restaurant is supposed to need to look like, or how much money needs to be spent in order to have the next newest, greatest, whatever that is, object or dining room or painting or etc. And I sure know I was never taught that, you know. And so in 10 years of working in the greatest restaurants in the world, I was never taught the importance of business fundamentals. And so we figured it out on our own. But it's now something that I pride myself on to pass on to our young employees. I think it's crucial.
I want to get a quick lightning round of nuts and bolts advice on an issue that I think all of you touched on, and then I want to open the floor up to questions, because I think this is such a fascinating topic and everybody has their own cultures. So I think more so than most panels, I really want to make sure we have a lot of time for questions. So, you know, reasonably fast answer. One thing that everyone talked about, or that everyone's comments have in common, is that to a large degree, some of this stuff, to someone who's not doing these things or hasn't considered the importance of these values and the importance of culture, a lot of it seems counterintuitive. I'll just pick an example. You spend a lot of time doing the CDR thing. It comes from the top down, and I'm assuming it's done individually at each restaurant, and you're asking employees to do it for each other. And certain people are saying, I've got this other work to do. This other thing is more important. And in the kitchen, I have, here's my prep list, and service starts at 5. I don't have time to do the things that you guys do to establish that culture, and I know that there are a lot of them. It's counterintuitive to think of generosity first in something that is a for-profit business, and that's going to be your business model is generosity, right? People think you're cuckoo. I know a lot of people get scared. As a business person, it's taking that counterintuitive step. It's someone once said to me a long time ago, I'm going to ask you to take steps you don't believe in, but I promise results that you can't imagine. And I've never forgotten that advice, and it changed my life. So I'm wondering, what advice would you give? A friend comes to you and says, I'm opening this business, I'm going to start doing X, Y, and Z, and you want to be supportive of them, and they're scared to actually do that next right thing, right? Which is such a crucial piece. What do you say? How do you wipe away the fear that's in the heart of people of taking that step off the edge of the cliff?
Please trust me. No, I will say that I feel like I have failed at this. I could not feel more aligned with what Bobby and Lachlan were talking about in terms of generosity. And when we are not generous to one another or to a guest, it just completely roils my insides. And I kind of feel like, on my tombstone, I really wanted to say, I told you, be generous. There are so many times when people who work in our organization are afraid that if they do the counterintuitive thing, it's going to somehow put us out of business. Or they're afraid that someone's trying to take advantage of us. And I just don't believe that. We've had one restaurant to this point go out of business in my career, which was Tabla, after 12 years. And Tabla ran the best food cost of any business we've ever had. And I think that there's something to learn from that. I think Tabla was the least generous restaurant we had. I think when you run the best food cost, it sometimes means that you're not necessarily giving the best value to your guests. Now, it's not really fair for me to take one example and say, you see, but I know that for its entire career, places like Union Square Cafe, which is now 31 years old, and Gramercy Tavern, which is 23 or something like that years old, they're incredibly generous restaurants. They believe that you get more when you first give more. And we think that the best metaphor for the culture of hospitality is the hug. You really want to get a hug? Go give one.
Sabato?
I think we talk about hospitality a lot, and it's not just a guest-facing term. And so by focusing on your employees first, and if hospitality is how you make somebody feel, that's how you make your employees feel. And to the generosity point, it's anybody can get a paycheck at the restaurant down the street. How can you give them more than just a paycheck? And so whether that's a trip to Italy to really understand the culture, whether that's a opportunity to learn how to butcher a whole animal, those are all ways of giving more than just a financial contribution to any one of your employees. And I think that's what really, they see that as an investment in themselves with it.
Yeah. I would say, you know, the biggest things that I think I take away today after all these years that I would pass on to someone would be this idea of not only challenging your team, but really valuing the individual. I think our restaurants, I think us, I think we did a very good job in the early years of doing the first part. You know, and when you're around all the time, and I'm sure Danny could speak to that, when you just have one restaurant for 10 years, it's easy to be around and challenge everyone constantly. And there's, I think in the back of your head sometimes, sadly, you think that, you know, if they can't go faster, I'm going to help them go faster. If they can't make this place clean, I'm going to clean it. If they're not going to make this taste the way I want it, I'm just going to cook it. And I think there's sadly, the value of that person just isn't maybe enough. But as you grow, striking this balance between keeping people challenged and inspired, but letting them know how much they're valued, I think is something that took me a long time to really understand.
And do you do that by the physical act of letting go and letting people sometimes fail, but actually letting them do it?
Yeah, and I think also doing a much better job now praising people for the strengths I know they have, and you know, there's a lot of people that work for us that don't necessarily believe, like you often believe in them more than they believe in themselves. I specifically can speak to the difference between perhaps a fast food labor pool, if you will, which is actually a real inspiring part of the industry because it's kind of everyone, versus a lot of the employees that may seek you out because they would like to have Frosca on their resume. You know, I'll give you a great example. If I were to ask any of the sous chefs, or even, you know, maybe even the lead line cooks at Frosca, if they could, you know, if they could have their own restaurant someday, or be the manager, they would say, "Are you kidding me? I could do it tomorrow." Right? There's an extraordinary amount of confidence. You take someone who's 20 years old. We have this woman who runs our busiest locale. She's 24 years old. I don't think she believed that she could actually do it. So by really not only challenging her, but by believing in her, and by praising the strengths that she had, and really valuing her, now she's blossoming into a great leader.
So Bobby, I come to you and I say, I have $100,000 in the bank. I'm sinking it into my own sandwich shop, me and my best friend. I'm nervous about letting go. I'm letting everything riding, you know, putting all my chips into the middle of the table. I've listened to all of this fantastic advice, but I'm scared shitless to actually do it. What do you say to me?
Well, the first thing I say is that's normal, right? Like, if you're not scared, you better get scared, right? Because something's going to hit you in the face, right? Like, that's the deal. Like, entrepreneurship is exciting, but wow, you know, a lot of things happen. I think it was, my dad was an entrepreneur. Lachlan's parents were academics in medicine. And my dad's a really quiet guy. But when Lachlan and I started, my dad was like, I mean, I didn't think twice about, like, Lachlan's going to be my business partner. And my dad was like, that is the smartest thing ever. Because my dad did not have a co-partner. He had this great business that he ran. He just retired last year. It's funny, none of his boys went into the business. A girl that went to my college, her first job out of college, went to work for my dad, became the president of the company and bought it. So his last 2 years of working, he worked for her. But he was really adamant about like, and I would pass this same advice on, is I see a lot of restaurants where it's a chef with no partner, or a front of the house guy hiring a chef, no partner.
They don't have an editor.
Yeah, it's really our partnership is the most incredible thing, and I would give that advice to everyone: is find a partner and enjoy the ups and then enjoy the roller coasters, enjoy everything that's going to happen, and you're going to edit each other. I mean, like, look, I'm not very talented. This guy is like really, really talented, not just as a chef, but also as directing me. I couldn't get as much done if I didn't have Lachlan doing that for me. And if
But you had the couch at the very beginning.
I had the couch.
You had the couch.
Yeah, but it really, I would tell everyone, if you're a young chef or a young front of the house guy and you're going to start a restaurant, do it as a partnership.
I love that. That was fantastic and very, very inspiring. Do we? Sarah has a microphone over there, so if you have a question, and there's another microphone on the other side. If you could raise your hand, and we have our first question already standing up in the blue and white striped shirt.
Okay, this question is for Danny. Can you give us an update on how the automatic service charge is coming along, both from a guest standpoint and an associate standpoint? And of course, how has it affected your culture?
I'd be happy to, and Sabato, who has been really intimately involved with the workings of it, I'm going to invite him to jump in. So the culture becomes a roadmap for that kind of decision. So if our culture says that we actually prioritize how we care for each other, even before how we care for our guests, and we're looking at an industry norm in New York City, and I think in many other parts of the country as well, that says that over the course of the last 20, 30 years, the compensation for tipped employees has actually gone up 300%, because what is a tip if not a multiplier of menu prices, which have only gone up? In fact, the multiplier has gone up in my career from 15% to 21%. And we're looking at a norm where non-tip eligible employees, also known as cooks and dishwashers, reservationists, etc., have seen their compensation in that same period of time go up 25%. How can you actually walk the talk of your culture about saying employees first when you actually mean it for the offense but not the defense? It would be like going into halftime and being the coach and you're behind and trying to motivate people where the offense is getting 10 times as much money as the defense and expecting the defense to feel really motivated. And we tried everything, free Metro cards for non-tip eligible employees, more education, you name it. And it just wasn't adding up. And so we said, we got to stop blaming the system. We have to stop saying, well, that's just the tipping system. Because whoever wrote the rule that you have to abide by it. You have to abide by the crazy laws if you accept tips, but you don't have to abide by anything. You can pay people the way you want to pay people. So we did it. We started with one restaurant at the end of 2015, which was the Modern. And we picked the Modern, obviously, on purpose because of two things. There's a bar, there's a more casual way to eat, there's a more formal way to eat, and there's private dining. So we thought it would give us the biggest view. We also thought that there was more elasticity price-wise because no one goes to the Modern in the first place for the purpose of saving money. So we learned a lot there, and it was really, really hard. But we came up with our own template, and we said, this whole crazy experiment only works. It's like a tennis tournament. You got to win the first. You can't win the tournament if you don't win the first round. And if you win the first, you better win the second. The first round is it's got to work for our staff. If it doesn't work for your staff, all bets are off for your guests. But if you can make it work for your staff, Then we thought we could win over the guests. And then the third round of the tournament, which is the hardest, actually they're all hard, is making it work for your investors at the same time, because you're looking at a mathematical equation, which is that what you're doing actually costs more than what it would have cost to just tip 21%, which is what New Yorkers basically tip, because many tip on top of the tax as well. Why does it cost more? Because we gave an automatic 20% raise immediately to our cooks. So that was more. The other thing we did was we raised the starting salary for managers, because one of the worst things about the tipping system is that it is a blockade for any kind of career advancement if you want to be a professional in the hospitality business. You get hooked on the drug of tips as a waiter or a bartender. It's not what you intended to do with your life. You wake up 25 years later and you can't get out of it, because in order to become a manager, you have to take a 25% pay cut. Or in order to go do the thing that you were trying to support just to get tips, you can't afford to go do that thing, and now you're too old to do anything. And we said, we've got to stop that. It's crazy. So that's why. But to your question, we've now rolled it out at 8 different businesses. And believe me, we would not be doing it if we thought it was going to kill our business. We tweak it at each restaurant. We get staff buy-in. Not any one of the restaurants does it exactly the same way. A couple of the restaurants said that in addition to raising our hourly rate way above minimum wage, so every time minimum wage goes up, we're immune. You have to charge more money every time minimum wage goes up. We don't. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's in about a year or so, with 1 or 2 more minimum wage bumps, we're going to be a better value with hospitality included and no tipping than places that have tipping, because if I go to your place and you raise your prices, I have to keep tipping on even higher prices. So by and large, we've made it work pretty well for our teams. Bumps along the way, lots of listening involved. The guests have no problem whatsoever. The first time a guest does it, there's a little bit of sticker shock when they see the menu, because even though the $26 chicken, they knew that in 2.5 hours they're going to take an extra $6 out of their pocket and add a tip. When they see $32, they somehow have a tough time doing the reverse math. But once they do it once and they get their bill and we do not add an extra line for a gratuity, they're cool. And now that we're doing it in 8 places, there's enough of a critical mass of experiences that they actually like it. They like it a lot. As far as our investors are concerned, we asked them right off the bat, and we said, look at this as an investment in our people, in our culture, in our business. And we actually think that you people who are willing to sink this many millions of dollars into a restaurant, hoping that in 3 to 10 years it might pay off, we think this is going to pay off well before 3 years. It's an investment for sure. We're not going to be as profitable in the first couple of years. And I think we need to be candid. We haven't been. It has squeezed us, but for the first time in the last decade, our chefs are not scratching to get good cooks. We have an abundance, whereas before we did this, we were running 10 to 14 cooks short. People were working double, triple shifts, horrible quality of life. And so in terms of why we did it, it is already working. And I'm going to just give it to you because I think you've had so much to do with the nuts and bolts.
I'll piggyback on what Lachlan was saying earlier about we teach chefs to cook and not necessarily teaching them about the business. One of the great things about Hospitality Included with the revenue share, we're taking a percentage of our gross revenue on a weekly basis and we're distributing that amongst our teams. So we're actually sharing that with our teams so they understand what the P&L looks like, understanding the decisions they make, and how that impacts the overall profitability of the business. And that's our sous chefs in the back, that's our first-time managers. So now, as they're growing in their career, the first time they see a P&L is not right when they've been promoted to executive chef or GM, and they're kind of white-knuckled and saying, how do I understand or comprehend this? We're actually giving them the tools to start to understand that much earlier on in their career. So now, with everybody aligned on a common target and understanding their contributions towards it, it's sort of one team, one dream working towards that. So that feels really good as our ability to invest in their growth as well as invest in the health of the business.
And it requires full transparency, which frankly we never did historically. You know, there's a sense, I would say historically, where the average restaurant worker would just assume that we were all raking it in. And now they know. They know exactly what the revenues are, and they know exactly where, you know, how thin things can be at the end.
Another question? Yes. Stand up. We're going to rush a microphone to you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Tracy Vaught from Houston. We have 4 restaurants, and I'd like to hear about your training program. I think that's one of the most important things we do is train our workers, and I'd like to hear a little bit about how you think about that, how do you organize it and take it from restaurant to restaurant. Do you have one person who's in charge of developing the training programs, or how do you do that in multi-concept?
I'll let both teams answer that because I think that you might find some slightly different answers. How do you guys deal with that?
You know, I'm going to hand this to Locke, and I'll tell you why. Lachlan runs our fast casual pizzeria locales, and I know the guy who's back working at Frosca. I've learned so much from his growth in the fast casual world, and that's maybe how we could all, in fine dining, learn a bunch from fast casual training. So I'm going to hand it over to him on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing that we noticed as a company and still, you know, perhaps struggle with at times is this idea that a lot's often taken for granted with an employee when they come to you with some experience, right? And so many restaurants, especially full-service restaurants primarily, Frosco would be a great example of this, is often receiving so much, capable talent like coming in. So perhaps someone was already a server somewhere. So maybe we don't have a server position for them, but they could start as back waiter if they're willing to and work their way up. Or someone comes in and they were the chef somewhere and they want to take a step back to learn again. There's kind of an understanding, I think, that happens that can be kind of a curse where there's where you are kind of feel that they already kind of know what to do. And I can speak from personal experience. I did this for many years, and I really boil it down to kind of one idea, and it wasn't really so apparent to me until I kind of stepped out of Frosco a little bit to try to turn my attention towards our quick service locale restaurants and that type of fast food employee and systems and all those kinds of things. And here it really is in a nutshell, is I don't think most restaurants do a good enough job creating a very clear expectation for what they want a particular person to do at a particular time at a particular station. I don't think they do a good enough job shadowing that person and really showing them, and then allowing them to then do it. And then the last most important piece, to validate that they can do it. And this last piece of validation, I know that we wouldn't do at Frosca on a culinary side over and over again, right? So if someone comes and says, you know, I used to grill down here and do that, there's kind of an assumption that they can cook something medium rare. They can create this type of great, grill mark, or they can make sure they can juggle this fish cooking at the same time as that particular lamb. And what I realized on the fast food side is you can't take anything for granted. And in fact, the minute that someone doesn't feel validated that they can do it is the minute they don't feel confident in their ability. And when they don't feel confident in their ability, at Frosca, they stick around and just get through it. But on the fast food side, they just fucking leave because they feel embarrassed. And so I really spent the last year really thinking about how to take someone who actually has never worked in a restaurant before and give them 3 very clear steps. Their role in prep, their role in that station when it comes to service, and then some overall general knowledge about the company and some inspiration that's really tangible that they can remember. Not everything, not a 6-hour orientation or something like this, but very tangible, and they can build on that. And they don't ever work alone until they've been validated in all those things. And it's incredible how confident they feel. And it's reduced our turnover, for example, by half. It's staggering because I'll tell you, when you're trying to do real cooking in a fast food environment, you can't handle the fast food 200% turnover norms. It's impossible, right? It's pretty obvious why most traditional fast food is when the button turns green, put the thing in, and when the button turns red, take the thing out. Because if it's 200% plus turnover, couldn't possibly teach anyone how to cook anything. For me, I realized our biggest issue was getting our people really confident in their ability and inspired by what we were doing. And it starts with really excellent, clear training, and then a validation at the end that they know and you know that they can do it. And so bringing that into the full service realm is something that we're starting to do, and I think we'll realize really great results.
So from our perspective, I think it's how to build the foundation, and that would be teaching the culture from the beginning. So the first week, it's really emphasizing that, and I think that's consistent, whether you're front of house, back of house. And then from there, with hospitality included, one of the benefits that we've seen from that was instead of rewarding people by outlasting or surviving longer than their peers, that's how you make money in a tipping world. You outlast the rest, and that's how you get the best schedules. Well, now every single job description includes a 100, a 200, and a 300 level. And with that, day one, we're outlining how you can grow, and here's the keys for you to unlock that growth. And that growth is both internal in terms of how you're growing yourself, how you're contributing to the overall team, as well as having peer evaluations along that way. So we're actually putting the carrot out there and allowing people to go along that way. And so that's how we've helped shape the trainings for those individuals by position, both front of house and back of house. The other neat piece that we've started to implement too is when we talk about our leaders, we do twice a year do a talent review. And it's not necessarily looking back, it's more looking forward. And it's saying, what are the aspirations of this leader, and what do we need to do to get ahead of it to make sure that we're able to develop them for that next step, whether it's 6 months down the road or whether it's a year down the road, rather than waiting to that point and say, you know what, that person would be great, but they don't have this. And so how can we start to foreshadow what they will need? And when I look at all the changes that are happening in our industry, we need to really define what the restaurant of the future is and what the leader of the future is. And so if it's someone that's going from a line cook to a sous chef today, well, if they're going to be an executive chef 5 years from now, what are they going to need? What skills are they going to need to lead that business and lead a team? And so it's really starting to adapt our training today to the talent pool that we have, as well as the industry that's constantly evolving, and more so than it ever has.
I'm just going to add one quick thing because I know we're just about out of time, but I really do believe in the old maxim, hire hard, train easy. Hire easy, train hard. And I think that amongst the most critical kinds of training that we try to do, and it always comes back to culture, is training to hire for the right emotional skills that are, that are actually going to thrive within the culture. Because that's where we succeed or fail. And it's almost, if you look at every employee that leaves, that exits either on their own or because we said they're not going to make it here, if you look back, I'm going to say in the vast preponderance of the times, it was a poor hiring choice. Someone who, they may be just an amazing human being, but not the right piece for this jigsaw puzzle. Because when we get the right piece for the jigsaw puzzle, the training part is not really that hard.
I'd like to thank all the members of our panel. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. American Express, Baltz and Company, you're fantastic. Please stick around, continue the conversation out in the anteroom where there are some refreshments. We'll see you back here at, was it 1:15? 1:30, and have a lovely rest of your morning.